Good afternoon, and welcome to Trans Justice in the U.S., a historical journey toward dignity and prosperity. My name is Suhaili Bautista Carolina. I use she, they pronouns, and I am the Director of Public Programs and Partnerships at the American LGBTQ+ Museum, a new collaboration dedicated to preserving, researching, and sharing LGBTQ+ history and culture that will open its first galleries in New York City in 2027. I am a brown-skinned woman wearing a green dress with flowers. I have gold earrings on with ginkgo flowers on them, and my hair is in a afro puff with 2 braids in front. We like to say at the American LGBTQ+ Museum that you do not have to wait until 2027 to experience the queer magic of this museum. In fact, you're experiencing right now. We're producing and presenting dynamic public programming, as well as traveling exhibitions centered on LGBTQ+ history and culture. And I encourage you to follow us on social media, subscribe to our monthly newsletter, become a founding member, attend a program, and stay engaged as our story continues to unfold. Today's virtual teach-in aims to illuminate significant milestones, pivotal movements, and the enduring struggles faced by the transgender community in their quest for wellness, dignity, and prosperity. 2 expert panelists, Shelby Chestnut, Executive Director at the Transgender Law Center, and Rodrigo Hang-Lehtinen, Executive Director at Advocates for Trans Equality, will deliver presentations on themes such as trans legacies of care, local and national collaborations, evolutions in law, policy, and advocacy from the 1990s to the present day, and access to healthcare at the intersection of race, gender, and other societal isms. Following these presentations, participants will engage in a facilitated panel conversation with Imara Jones, journalist and CEO of Translash Media, allowing for a deeper conversation on the issues raised before opening the floor to a Q&A session with you, our virtual audience. Before we begin, I'd like to share our virtual land acknowledgement. While we are gathered in a virtual space today, we are each tuning in from our respective Indigenous lands. I myself am joining you from present-day New York City, the unceded homeland of the Lenape. We respect the diverse Indigenous peoples connected to the territories on which we reside and gather, and honor the energy and stewardship of these lands by all Indigenous generations, past, present, and future. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Imara Jones. Imara Jones, whose work has won Emmy and Peabody Awards, is the founder and CEO of Translash Media, a cross-platform nonprofit journalism and narrative organization which produces content to shift the current culture of hostility towards transgender people in the U.S. She was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people on the planet in 2023. As part of her work at Translash, Imara hosts the Translash podcast, which received the 2023 Outstanding Podcast Award from GLAAD, as well as the investigative limited series, The Anti-Trans Hate Machine, A Plot Against Equality, which received the Excellence in Podcasting Award from the National LGBTQ+ Journalists Association. Imara is also the first trans person to ever receive an award from the National Black Journalists Association, having garnered the Journalist of Distinction Award in 2022. Also in 2022, Politico named her as one of the 40 power players at the intersection of race, politics, and policy in the United States. In 2020, Imara was featured on the cover of Time magazine as part of its New American Revolution special edition. In 2019, she chaired the first ever UN high-level meeting on gender diversity with over 600 participants. Imara has been featured regularly in The Guardian, The Nation, MSNBC, CNBC, NPR, Fast Company, and GQ. Imara is the 2021 Nathan Cummings Foundation Fellow and a 2019 Soros Equality Fellow. Without further ado, I would like to invite Imara to the virtual stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suhaili, and welcome everyone. Today I am here also as a member of the LGBTQ plus Museums Board, which gives me a tremendous amount of pleasure, and thrilled that the museum is able to begin its journey through programs like this. So welcome. Um, we have an amazing conversation today with two powerful members of our community, Shelby Chestnut and Rodrigo. Um, uh, uh, why am I blanking? But Rodrigo Leighton, and we're going to begin with a presentation from the both of them, and then followed by that, we'll open it up to a discussion from the both of you. In advance of both of them speaking, Shelby and then Rodrigo hang Leighton, which, COVID brain, hurricane brain, election brain had me blank out for just a minute. We'll begin by reading the bios of each one. They'll follow with a presentation to spark conversation. I will then kick us off with a couple of questions. And then from that, we'll also take questions that you all will submit in the chat. So first up today is Shelby Chestnut, who goes by they, them. Shelby is a movement leader and policy expert with over 20 years of experience. They are the first Native trans executive director at the Transgender Law Center, where they started as the director of policy and programs. Throughout their decades of experience, notable successes include helping to launch projects like the Disability Project, Black Trans Circles, and the Trans Agenda for Liberation, the community-led guide, which outlines solutions towards a better world for all. Shelby is the current chair of the Board of Trustees at Antioch College. So without further ado, Shelby, I'm excited to hear what you're going to present.
Thanks so much, Amara. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, especially with so many people that I love and respect and are doing amazing things in the world. So I have a little bit of a slide presentation and we'll walk us through that. And then as Amara said, we'll do some questions and answers towards the end. So we can go ahead and share that. Awesome. So like Amara said, my name is Shelby Chestnut. I'm the executive director of the Transgender Law Center. For those who have never heard of us, we're headquartered in Oakland, California. We have offices in New York and we have staff all over the country. We're the largest trans-led organization fighting on behalf of trans people in the United States, and I'm just honored to be here alongside my colleagues. So as I think trans lives have started to take more of a center stage in both public debate and just mainstream culture, we're also seeing more and more trans historians and artists and activists archiving and documenting trans stories. And I think it's for us important to think about where we came from and how we got here. So going back even to the 19th century, we see people like Frances Thomas, who was an anti-rape activist, former slave, and believed to be the first trans woman to testify in front of Congress. I share that both as a historical marker, but also the importance that legacy plays in our progress to where we are right now. And this year, while TLC does a ton of stuff, including impact litigation, movement building, and narrative change work, we're focusing all of our work this year on the legacies of caretaking. We're doing this to honor both our trans ancestors and the legacies of our community, which includes mutual aid, family, and doing that to dream of the world I think that we all deserve to be living in, present day and in the future. I think what's important to contextualize is that often caretaking is intertwined with state violence. And as we navigate these harmful systems, we redefine what justice is. So for trans people, taking care of our communities and those around us is justice. Nurturing is justice, and providing each other with the love and support is justice. And I thought how fitting to have two of our mothers of our movement and the caretaking that they gave so many of us, particularly those in New York for many generations, a picture of Marcia and Sylvia, and it says, "We tend to the seeds they planted, so they will forever bloom." So we can go ahead to the next slide. And I apologize, I forgot to do an image description of myself. I am wearing a light pink pastel shirt with a pink background. I have light skin, I'm Native American, and I have a lot of hair, but it's pulled back and it is salt and pepper. So I think a big picture setting and sort of where we're at in trans organizing, we have to think about our rich sort of histories of caretaking. And I think a prominent example of that is the ballroom culture. And there's a long history of ballroom culture that dates back to the 19th century, but I think ballroom that most of us know today started in the 1960s or 70s. It started in places like the Northeast and New York. Ballroom was a prominent feature for queer and trans people of color. Ballroom culture also became popularized through TV shows like Pose, Yay Pose, voguing, etc. But where we began to more familiarize it, I think, as a society as a whole, not just queer and trans people of color. What to me is, I think, important to lift up about ballroom culture is that at its core, it was families and its community, its support for people who are often ostracized from their biological families, harmed by social systems, and targets of police. Ballrooms provided love and support, oftentimes food, access to healthcare, money, places to sleep, trading information to keep each other safe, and places to go when they had experienced harm, and used their prominence to advocate against state harm. So here is a really powerful quote from Marcia that I like to lift up, which is, "I'll always be known for reaching out to young people who have no one to help them out. So I help them out with a place to stay or some food to eat or some change for their pockets. And they never forget it. A lot of times I've reached my hand out to people in the gay community that just didn't have nobody to help them when they were down and out." And here's a picture of the STAR, the Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries, which if you haven't learned about that, you should look it up. It's just amazing history in our movements. Let's go to the next slide, which I think is something maybe we're all a little bit more familiar with, of those of us that are here, and some of us survived this era of time. I think another key marker in our sort of history of trans movement is the caretaking that happened during the AIDS crisis. So obviously the AIDS epidemic started in the 1980s and was devastating to a lot of communities, but particularly queer and trans people of color. And here you start to see where state systems blamed queer and trans communities, refused care, and queer and trans people use what little they did have to try and support each other through medical care, through grief counseling, and the Revolutionary Act to just survive that moment. During this period and after, you see Black trans women and trans women of color are often underrepresented in the dominant narrative around the HIV/AIDS epidemic, while still disproportionately being impacted. These legacies of care really allowed for us to navigate the crisis, creating justice, but also in a way for us to look at sort of how we care for each other differently. I want to lift up someone who's very near and dear to my heart and near and dear to TLC. When I think about this history within the LGBT movement and our legacies of care, I'm thinking about my colleague, Cecilia Chung, who is a senior advisor at the Transgender Law Center, who for decades, her activism on behalf of people living with HIV and AIDS and all of the lives she's changed. At TLC, she's played an instrumental role when we created Positively Trans, a national network supporting trans people living with HIV, and had a transformative effect on healthcare, housing, and legal protections. So let's call Cecilia into the room. She's still out there doing amazing work now at the global level with the UN AIDS, and she's just somebody that I think we can all look to for that sort of legacies of care and both resistance and change at the same time. Similarly, I think, let's go to the next slide. It was around this time where, and this is a press release from the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. You can look at it while it's on the screen. But the 1980s was also that time in our country's history when the tough on crime policies and victim rights movement really started to take off. The idea behind it was that the way to deal with violence, whether it was intimate partner violence, whether it was sexual violence, whether it was hate violence, was through police response, more prosecution, and increased punishments for those who caused harm. Thus, that created a lot of the modern day hate crimes that were born and we're still relying on today. The idea behind it promised that there was harsher punishments to people who caused harm to identity-based populations, and they would get enhanced penalties as a result of that. So I'll read a quote that I think contextualizes the environment from former President George H.W. Bush, those remember him. The faster that we find out about these hideous crimes, the faster we can track down bigots who commit them, help us move toward our dream, a society blind to prejudice. And I think, going on to the next slide, what we've learned in this time is that hate crimes laws have expanded significantly, becoming normalized part of our legal landscape. But what it hasn't done is sort of change the lived conditions of people impacted by that violence. And here's a picture of Monica Roberts. If you don't know about Monica, you should. She's since passed and is an ancestor at this point, but Monica, for years, was one of the few trans women of color, the only Black trans woman. She was in Texas, reporting on the trans violence that has really increased in the last decades in society, and calling it out day after day, reporting on it, and making sure that it was a widely known issue that people needed to take seriously. And so I think while the broader socio-political focus was on hate crimes laws and increasing policing, trans communities continued to care for one another, but also lift up the insidious violence that we're facing and call on other groups to take action. This is also around the same time where you start to see trans organizations popping up around the country and never before. I've been doing this work for a long time, and 10, 15 years ago, you could probably count on one hand how many trans organizations were in existence. And now I think we have one in almost every state. But it's also a time when you start to see a lot of tensions grow. Awareness of the ongoing harm of our communities by police, acceptance that policing as an institution is not our source of liberation, and yet whenever harm happened, there were calls to treat our violent incidents like hate crimes and to call the police. But I think ultimately what happened is that our community became critical of how the systems of policing were impacting our communities, but our broader communities of color, low-income communities, et cetera. So I'm going to go next to a video that we put together with a partnership with IDEO that I think gives a historical context and a present context that would be helpful for us. We have to do a little switcheroo, apologies.
Picture a world where trans people are loved, honored, respected, where we are nourished, blessed, and held in the highest regard. This is what our transcestors wanted for us. This is what they dreamed into being. They fed us, housed us, protected us. They turned communities into family. They treated us as full and whole. They believed in our joy. These days, the stories the mainstream tells you about trans people are all about the violence against us, transphobic attacks, houselessness, unemployment, over-policing, all the ways the world wants to erase us. But we're still here, and we deserve so much more. We deserve more than hate crime laws. Like those who came before us, we can imagine more than what exists. We can create more than has ever been imagined, because we deserve it, and we know it.
We are living in a moment of unprecedented visibility, but recognition doesn't mean safety, especially when it's coming from the state as hate crime laws. All these laws do is put people behind bars longer without addressing the systems at the root of anti-trans violence, and they're regularly used to lock up the very communities they claim to protect. Hate crime laws are just symbolic gestures that don't provide any actual resources to trans communities. Instead, they funnel money into more policing and prisons, into anti-Black, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, anti-sex worker, ableist, and transphobic systems. The same systems our ancestors fought so hard against. The same systems our communities are fighting to defund and abolish now. Hate crime laws are not the answer. It's time we harness our power and get what we really deserve. And it's time, that's what we demand.
We deserve a future where we are thriving and fully resourced. A future that honors the legacy of the beloved community members we've lost and finishes what they've started.
Where money goes not to hate crime laws and the systems that have always harmed us, but directly to our communities. Where we work alongside our allies to protect trans lives, shift the narratives, and uplift what we really need.
We don't need hate crime laws. We don't need longer prison sentences or more cops. We need more resources, more mutual aid, more free public transportation, more housing, more trans-led organizations.
More power and autonomy over our lives. So let us lead ourselves. Let us be seen, nurtured, and held in the highest regard. It's what our community has always done for one another, and it's what we must keep doing now.
Because we are the ones imagining more and creating more. We know it's what we deserve, and we know it's what's truly possible.
Awesome. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. I share that video because I think it's a clear display of the ways that we're connecting our histories of caretaking and reminding our communities of our legacy and investing back into our communities. It's an opportunity, I think, to both honor our legacies of interdependence, nurturing our communities and those around us, and that really defining what justice is for our communities. And this, the image here reads, "Our protection lies in each other. Safety is a community effort." And then earlier this spring, TLC had the immense pleasure of convening people in Durham, North Carolina for a caregiver convening where we brought together parents of trans kids, trans parents, trans youth, and caregivers more broadly. I think the age range was 6 months to 75 years old, and really held space together to think about what are our joys and what are our struggles and how do we unify them together. I think their experiences in this convening and for us as staff really gave us a lot of courage to continue facing the uncertain political terrain that we're navigating and find ways that we can lift each other up and find survival mechanisms. So let's go to a little video about that. And then I have a couple more slides.
Care looks like giving each other the support to be our authentic selves.
Care comes in all kinds of families.
The care that we give one another allows us to build a world
where we can live free from boxes.
Care is a futuristic act.
I love that video just because for me, it's a moment to take pause and think about just our legacies of care, but also I think the joy that our community brings us. And you'll hear later from Rodrigo just some of the political terrains that our communities are navigating. But I do think it's a moment too where when we come together and are resourced and fulfilled as people, the possibilities are endless for that. Let's go back to the slide, sorry. So to that end, and we're inching towards the end of my presentation, TLC for the last 10 years has been working with grassroots organizations around the country, fighting the anti-trans bills and laws that are being put forward by legislatures. And when we started the work, oftentimes people would be like, we don't know how to fight these bills. We don't know sort of how to organize people. We don't know how to get people to take us seriously. So we spent a lot of time providing sort of technical assistance support for groups on the ground on how to navigate these bills, how to talk to legislatures, et cetera. And, you fast forward today, and like I said earlier, it's like 10 years ago, there was maybe a handful of trans organizations around the country. And fast forward to right now, there's almost one in every state. Trans people are meeting this moment and building this just impenetrable movement of resilience and joy and liberation. But the number one thing that folks say time and time again is that they need more funds to meet this moment. So a few weeks ago, TLC, with Emergent Fund, launched the Action for Transformation Fund to move $1 million of rapid response funds into the field to support trans-led organizing, healing, and power building. And again, this was a moment, I think, for us to use our reach, our resources, and just our stance in the community to say, hey, let's meet this moment. So let me read a quote from the inaugural Transformation Fund director, which is, trans communities have always been at the forefront of world building. Under any conditions, trans organizing continues to be a critical site of power and possibility. From Star House's revolutionary services to the fierce love of house mothers, trans communities have created legacies of self-determination, resilience, and care. So I share that because this fund is an opportunity to get money directly back into our communities and prioritize Black, Indigenous, people of color, disabled, deaf communities who are trans leaders at the forefront of what we're doing. So if you know folks in your circles or you yourself are in need of funds, I would encourage you to take a look at this site and see if it might be applied for you. And it's a way, I think, for us to continue to build our sort of trans brilliance, resilience, and resistance in this moment when we're constantly told we don't have enough, we're not enough. Lawmakers are making it a point to sort of make us the focal point of elections and debates. And we're here to say that we're not going anywhere. So let's go to the last slide and I'll close. Is that the last slide? Sorry. It is the last slide. I cut it down. So I will end with that. Reminder to check out the Action for Transformation Fund, and just major appreciation for having TLC here today and letting me share a little bit of sort of the history of trans organizing and some of our work.
Thank you so much, Shelby. Really appreciate that. Next, we are going to hear from Rodrigo Hang-Leitinen, who is the Executive Director of Advocates for Trans Equality, also known as A4TE. Rodrigo is a policy advocacy and messaging expert. Rodrigo is a proud Cuban-American trans man with a career spanning over 16 years in policy, with wide-ranging experience in the LGBTQI movement that has covered field organizing, volunteer training, leadership development, fundraising, and media advocacy. Rodrigo's experience in strategic messaging on trans issues has established him as a subject matter expert, constantly sought out by advocates lawmakers, and the media for his ability to craft persuasive messaging to advance trans rights with audiences across the political spectrum. In 2019, he joined NCTE as Deputy Director for Policy and Action. NCTE was Advocate for Trans Equality's predecessor. And in 2021, he assumed the role of Executive Director. In January 2024, NCTE revealed plans to merge with the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, or TILDEF, resulting in the formation of the new entity called Advocates for Trans Equality, with Rodrigo continuing in the role as Executive Director. So Rodrigo, please take us through your presentation and share your thoughts.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Imara. It is such an honor to be here with you all today, and I am so excited for the LGBTQ Museum to be getting off the ground and that you all are already doing programming, even while you get everything going. Such an inspiration. So I'm going to talk a little bit about trans history and present moment, especially when it comes to political activism. And to give a visual description of myself, I am a short, light-skinned Latino trans man, short hair, wearing aqua glasses and a patterned sweater with a bright red wall behind me. And if, Lucy, if you could please put the slide deck up, please. Thank you so much. Excellent. So this will be a little bit about trans political history. And to be clear, that's not all trans history, nor is it even all the history of trans activism, because as Shelby already covered here, trans people have been facing oppression and societal attacks for a very long time and have been responding and organizing and fighting back for just as long. And that fighting back takes a lot of different forms, not just this kind of more straight up political form. But that's what I'm going to be talking about today to put a little more texture on this part of our activism. So next slide, please. Well, you already got my bio. I won't bore you with that. So next slide, please. But again, my name's Rodrigo Hengwayton. And so first, a little context here about trans people in society. You know, Shelby covered this a little bit too, but trans people are now much more visible than we have ever been before. And yet that visibility is an imperfect thing. It can be a double-edged sword. Visibility means that more people know us and see us, but it does not necessarily mean that more people accept us. And it certainly doesn't mean that we are guaranteed safety or security or the resources that we need to thrive. So, you know, visibility is, I think, an important step along the process of liberation. It is part of what it takes to get what we need, but it is not a goal in and of itself. An example of how visibility has changed so much, even in recent years, is that I came out in 2007. I happen to be 38 years old, and I came out, I think I was 21. This is 2007. Hopefully, I'm doing the math right. And that was not that long ago. But even still, when I would tell people that I was transgender and that my name was Rodrigo, they would say, okay, when are you going to become a woman? Because they did not know that transgender men existed. And now that doesn't happen as much anymore. More people in the American public kind of understand that trans men exist and that non-binary people exist. And there's a little more recognition of what it means to an average person when I say I'm transgender. So visibility has grown a lot, even in that relatively short amount of time. But we are still facing challenges. Visibility doesn't automatically come with freedom or safety or security. We're still facing threats in policy, in the legal system, in the media that silences our voices or puts out gross mischaracterizations of who we are, and many of us encounter discrimination in our everyday lives. So we won't achieve trans rights or acceptance overnight, but we can get there. but we will not get there alone. It takes all of us. So if any of you are allies on this Zoom, if any of you are not part of the trans community yourself, we still need you. And thank you for being here, for standing shoulder to shoulder with us. It's going to take all of us together to achieve this liberation. Next slide, please. So just real quick, you might be wondering what the hell is A4TE? This is a very new name. We are a new organization formed from the merger of two organizations that had both been around for about 20 years fighting for trans rights. TILDEF, or the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, was a 20-year-old organization that primarily secured trans rights through litigation and also through helping people with direct legal services. And then there was NCTE, the National Center for Transgender Equality. We worked to secure trans rights through policy and advocacy and organizing. And now we came together to form Advocates for Trans Equality. And I'm going to go through kind of what we do, not only because it's about A4TE, but also it gives you a sense of the kind of activism that trans people across the board engage in to try to change the political system. Next slide, please. First is policy. Governmental attacks have dramatically escalated in just the last few years alone. A lot of people do not realize this, but from 2020 to today, there was a tsunami of anti-transgender bills in state legislatures. This was all around the country in red states, purple states, blue states. Almost every single state in the United States of America had an anti-transgender bill filed. In many cases, dozens of anti-transgender bills. In just this year alone, in just 2024, we tracked over 600 anti-trans bills. Plus, some of these, by the way, are also federal, meaning that they were in Congress at the national level. These bills cover a lot of different topics, but altogether, they really demonstrate a threat against our ability to live our daily lives. They attack every facet of the daily trans experience, from schools to sports to healthcare to IDs like driver's licenses and birth certificates. So we advocate at the state and federal level for laws and policies that improve our lives, not these kinds of policies that make our lives harder. And it's on all of us to educate our lawmakers about trans people and our needs. Next slide, please. There's also legal work. So this means supporting trans people navigating the legal system. The legal system is in no way, shape, or form set up to help trans people. It is based on the assumption that trans people do not exist. So a lot of these systems are completely opposite to our needs. One example of the kind of work we do is the name change project. If you've never had to change your name, you can take it for granted how important it is to have an ID that accurately reflects who you are. For most people, they've never had to think about that. But for trans people, as well as some other folks, it can be really difficult to get an ID that actually matches who you are, that shows the name you want to be called every day, that shows the right gender marker, whether that's M for male, F for female, or in some states, X for non-binary or not specified, depends on where you live, what the exact definition of X is. But X allows you to have some kind of option outside of just the rigid M or F. So we have a name change project that helps with that. If you need support, if you yourself are wondering how to change your IDs, check out our website, transequality.org. We have resources for you. And there's also the Trans Health Project. This helps people navigate insurance for transition-related healthcare. Thanks to the advocacy of so many trans people across the country, including my colleagues at TLC, with Shelby, and so many other organizations in the movement, we've secured healthcare protections that essentially force insurance companies to cover healthcare for us, just like they would for any other patient. But in practice, sometimes people still get unfairly denied. So if that happens to you, we can help. Check out the Trans Health Project. And worst comes to worst, we can also sue. So we do file court cases to win trans rights. in front of judges, as does, Shelby and their team at Transgender Law Center. Next slide, please. And then there's mobilization. This means organizing, on the ground organizing. Everything that I just shared about policy and legal, it can sound super far away. It can sound inaccessible because most of us grow up with a healthy distrust of government. And it is easy to feel like why bother pushing the courts or Congress or a state legislature when they're never going to change? And I understand that cynicism. That is where organizing comes in. This is about getting all of us on the ground to really take direct action, to put the heat on these lawmakers and to change the game. So we alert supporters about opportunities to speak out against these anti-trans attacks. That means contacting your legislators. That means testifying in state houses and before Congress. It's important to know that in a lot of states, you can just show up and testify. The exact rules of it depend on where you live. But for the most part, if you live in that state, you have the right to share your point of view, to give testimony, to submit your comment, whether or not you are a citizen and whether or not there's any other, your age or any other status, you can testify. So that's a really important tactic. And then there's voter engagement, getting people out to vote at the local, state, and national elections. Obviously, there's a presidential election before us right now, but president isn't even the only thing. There are school board races. Depending on where you live, there may be judges on the ballot. There are so many of these positions up for a vote, and a lot of people don't bother to vote or can't vote. So if in those races, so if you are eligible to vote, I really encourage you to do so, to turn out and vote all the way down the ballot. Vote in those primaries, vote in those off-year elections, meaning the ones that are kind of a weird time of year and they don't get as much attention. When you vote in those elections, you can really change the outcome. And a lot of the rules that restrict us as trans people on a daily basis are actually made by those decision makers. A lot of these rules that govern our day-to-day lives aren't even about the president. They're done by the school board or the local sheriff or these other positions. So make sure to go out and vote. And we have a resource, transformthevote.org, where we can help you navigate voter ID laws if you're worried about your ID when casting a ballot, or if you don't know where your polling place is, how do you even vote? Where do you show up? Check out transformthevote.org. Next slide, please. And then elections. Another thing we do is we endorse trans people and allies running for office. And we do coaching, hands-on coaching for trans candidates running for office. So if you are interested in running for office and you don't know where to start, hit me up. Contact A4TE. We can help you. The thing is that in order to secure, if you were going to win on trans rights, we need to be determining who even gets elected in the first place. Yeah, we can lobby and we can pressure and we can mobilize on the people who are in power, but how much more effective would it be if we could control who even gets to power in the first place? So that's why it's important to vote, but it's also important for us to run for office ourselves, trans people and allies. And you can start with these local races that can be a lot less intimidating and a lot less expensive than you might think. So think about it. Next slide, please. And then there's research. This can sound really nerdy and wonky, but is vital. We can't pressure the government to solve a problem that we can't even prove exists in the first place. And we all know from our lived experience that trans people face a lot of barriers, but there wasn't any data to actually prove it. So lawmakers wouldn't listen to us. And now we have that data. There's the US Trans Survey, the USTS. This is the largest ever survey of the trans community, led for and by trans people ourselves. Over 90,000 trans and non-binary people took the most recent survey just 2 years ago, and that was huge. And this covered topics like healthcare, housing, family acceptance, safety, IDs, jails and prisons, immigration detention facility experiences. So much was covered here. So I really encourage you to check it out. This is a treasure trove. If you're ever wondering more about the kinds of problems that trans people face, or if you are having to needing this for your advocacy, you need tools to be able to demonstrate why trans people need more services or a change in policy, you can use this data from the US Trans Survey. It is free and available to all. Next slide, please. Then there's education. Knowing your rights in this environment can be really difficult and confusing. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and the rules are changing all the time. So we have Know Your Rights resources to help trans people navigate systems like healthcare, schools, updating your documents. And we can also train you in storytelling. So if you want to share your story to change public opinion, to change hearts and minds, we have resources to help you with that. Next slide, please. Now, some history about this political organizing. The first ever National Transgender Lobby Day was in 1996. And this was huge because lobbying is usually something trans people are totally shut out of. Lobbying is the kind of thing that's associated with, really wealthy people who have access to power and expensive education. And so it was really a watershed moment for trans people ourselves to organize ourselves to say, you know what, we deserve a part of this government too. Lawmakers should be listening to us. This was a huge part of advocacy. So in 1996, the first ever National Transgender Lobby Day, organized by Gender PAC. And then there was the establishment of the National Transgender Advocacy Coalition. This was led by Yosenio Lewis, who was going to be here today. Unfortunately, couldn't join us, but a huge leader in the community. And that organization held lobby days starting in 2001, really kept this going. 2008, Diego Sanchez spoke to Congress. And this was huge. This was one of the very first times that a trans person had spoken before Congress. It was not the very first. Shelby mentioned the very first that had been a century earlier. But having Diego do this in 2008 was huge. Trans people had not had access to this for so long. And he testified about discrimination that transgender people face in the workplace. In 2013, TILDEF, one of the two organizations that led to A4TE, TILDEF filed a lawsuit and that eventually secured the first ruling in the nation holding that trans students must be allowed to use school facilities that match their authentic genders. So that trans kids in schools could use the bathroom that they felt safest in and use the facilities that could make them secure every day. A few years later, in 2017, Andrea Jenkins became the first Black trans woman elected to public office. And she is still in office today. This is the Minneapolis City Council. And this was an enormous victory for trans people's representation in government. And then lastly, just this year, A4T held the Trans Day of Empowerment at the US Capitol. We brought in over 75 advocates to speak with members of Congress, mostly trans, a few allies, people from all over the country to talk with their elected officials and representatives. Next slide, please. Here is a photo of coverage of this Transgender Lobby Day. This was the one in 1997, organized by Gender PAC. And here you see this profile of it from the magazine Transgender Tapestry. This magazine doesn't exist anymore, but it is a really incredible resource, a powerful outlet that covered our community for so many years, and their archives are still available online. So if you're interested in more transgender history, I would really recommend checking out Transgender Tapestry. Next slide, please. Here's Diego Sanchez, the trans man I mentioned, who testified before Congress. So here he is testifying about anti-trans workplace discrimination. And he was also a founding board member of NCT. So shout out to Diego. Next slide. Monica Roberts, a huge pillar of our community. Shelby already spoke about Monica, but again, she was a political organizer. She was a journalist. She did so much to raise awareness and consciousness about the experiences of Black trans women, especially the violence against Black trans women. For so many years, she was the only one tracking this violence, and we really could not have achieved what we have achieved as a community without her. Next slide. Cecilia Gentili, many of you may have known her personally. If you're in New York, like the museum is, Cecilia was also a pillar of our community organizer, activist, artist, and creator. She was the co-founder of the group Decrim New York, and she passed away just earlier this year. Next slide, please. Andrea Jenkins, who I mentioned, first Black openly trans woman elected to office in the Minneapolis City Council. Also an A4TE board member. Next slide. Now here's what you can do. Again, the trans community is not going to be able to win without you all as allies. We need everyone to be part of this, trans people and allies, both speaking out and organizing and mobilizing. So one thing you can do concretely is learn and share accurate information about trans people and trans rights. This might sound really obvious, but the thing is, most people still don't really understand what it is to be trans. And so they fall for misinformation. They fall for these lies and myths and distortions about healthcare for trans people or about trans kids in schools. They fall for these lies because they're not being told any differently. So it is on us to really get the accurate information and speak out then if someone in our life is falling for this misinformation. Another thing you can do is speak out in governmental things. So school board meetings, contact your legislators, go vote, talk to your neighbors. And this is important everywhere in the country. If you live in a bluer state or a more supposedly liberal area, you might think that there's no point in doing this, that there's no need. But the thing is, trans people are facing attacks everywhere in the country, including urban areas and cities, including in blue states. When you look at where trans people, especially trans women and Black and Latina trans women, even more specifically, when you look at where Black and Latina trans women are attacked, I mean, physically attacked and even murdered, it is all over the country. It is not necessarily that much safer, certainly not safer enough in a city or in a blue state than elsewhere. So that means that support for trans rights and support for trans people and trans liberation is still not high enough, even in a place like, let's say, New York City or Brooklyn. So no matter where you live, it is important that you do this. Also, when it comes to state legislation and governmental policy, these anti-trans bills are being introduced even in these blue states. And if those bills make it actually get some votes and have some measure of success, then the opposition, anti-trans opposition, tries to do it even more places. So even if you're in a blue state where you think an anti-trans bill is not going to pass, we still need you to call your legislators, email your legislators, postcard your legislators, whatever it takes to tell them that you're watching and you want them to vote against it, because that's what will keep the bill from moving forward, and that's what will keep it from becoming a bigger problem in the future. And then lastly, give your time, give your donations, give your money, get involved, donate to trans-led organizations. As Shelby mentioned, there are trans-led organizations all over the country now, in almost every single state. So yes, of course, I would love for you to give to nationals like TLC and A4TE, but also give to the trans-led organizations where you live. This is all important work, and it takes resources to get it done. So volunteer and donate. And yeah, last slide, please. That is it for me. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will turn it back over to Amara.
Thank you both so much. While we wait for a couple of questions to roll in, we'll have time just for one or two. I wanted to ask both of you all, just kind of going back to the theme of the conversation, which is, can you both describe for you, what is trans justice? What does justice for trans people look like?
Well, that is a big question. I'm happy to go first, but Shelby may have a different answer. I mean, I would say for me, it looks like trans people having the freedom to be our authentic selves without having to worry that that's going to cost us something, without having to worry that that's going to make us unsafe, that it's going to put us at risk, that it's going to cost us our job or our relationships with our family and the people we love. The victory looks like a trans person being able to come out and have it be kind of not a big deal, or at least that they can get access, that happiness that comes with living your authentic self without the fear and the anxiety and the backlash. So that's what freedom looks like for me.
I love that question, Amara. Thanks. And I echo a lot of what Rodrigo said. I think at the end of the day, it's the freedom for all of us to be our authentic selves and to live outside of the boxes that society puts us in. And that includes people that aren't trans. I'll share a story that I always think is like kind of like justice in its living example, which is this was like 2017. The Texas legislature was introducing one of its first really horrendous anti-trans healthcare bills, and TLC and a bunch of groups were down there supporting local organizers, and we defeated the bill. And there was a celebratory pool party afterwards, and there was like young trans kids there. And I was like sitting at the pool trying to just like be cool and blend in and meet people that I didn't know. And this little girl comes up to me. She was like 9 years old, so she must be in like high school now. She goes, "Oh, you work for TLC." And I was like, "Oh, this is so cute. This little trans kid knows about the Transgender Law Center." And I said, "Yeah, I help trans people like you and me." And she looked at me and she goes, "Oh, never mind. I thought you worked for the Dinosaur Channel." And so the fact that this 9-year-old trans kid living in Texas had a supportive family and could just like be like, "I don't know anything about the Transgender Law Center, or I don't really want to be bothered by trans rights," because she was cared for, like that is justice to me. I think in a moment where youth particularly are becoming the debate of the politicians across the country, and there's just so much misunderstanding and frankly and disinformation around trans kids accessing healthcare. I often think about, I think her name was Madeline. I think about her and just the justice that she embodied because her family cared for her.
Oh, Imara, you're on mute.
What do you think of the greatest threats to trans justice, and specifically beyond the ones that you've already touched upon, because you all did both do some of that in your presentation. But I mean, and specifically, do you think that it's possible in this moment? What for you is what you think are kind of the greatest threats, and given whatever those are, do you think it's possible in this moment to move towards justice for trans people? Why don't we start in reverse order? So why don't you start, Shelby?
Yeah, well, I'll preface it by saying I'll maybe have a different answer in like 5 weeks, 6 weeks. I do think it's possible. And I think for me, the biggest threat right now is that people don't understand our communities, and it's on all of us, cultural change makers, artists, activists, lawyers, doctors, to stand up for what we believe is right. And that is to give all people the dignity and respect and the care that we deserve. And that includes trans people. I think that we are in a moment right now, especially where people in positions of power, whether that's lawmakers, whether that's doctors, they're choosing to target our communities, but also they're choosing to not stand up for our communities. And I think that the work that, TLC is doing every day, that A4TE is doing every day, the work that you're doing with Translash is telling these vibrant, rich stories of who we are and that we deserve to be respected. I do think, that said, that we are looking at some political losses across the country. Like, we are living in a time where certain states will not allow for healthcare for trans people. And I think those of us that are living in states that do allow for healthcare of all ages, like, we need to start thinking about how we secure and protect and welcome those that might not have access to healthcare in their home state. And I think, trans people were built for this political moment. We look out for each other. We've always cared for each other, found ways to live, even when we don't have rights, even when we don't have money ourselves. So I think we need to lean into that more heavily right now.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I mean, I think the biggest threat we are facing right now is the inevitable phenomenon that progress comes with backlash. We made a lot of progress as a trans people in the last 20 years. And now we are experiencing this backlash. The reason that we are so under attack right now is because we've actually been succeeding. There's this phrase been attributed to a lot of different people, but I'm not sure. So I'm not sure exactly who started it. But first they fight you. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. For a long, long time, trans people, at least in Western society, lived in this phase of being ignored. First, they ignore you. And then for a long time, we were laughed at. And now they are fighting us. That, as weird as it may sound, is what progress looks like in the political process, because we do not win without overcoming this opposition. There is an organized group of people who feel threatened by the liberation that we represent. Trans people, they're organized and well-funded group of people who believe in what I think it's fair to say is authoritarianism, and certainly gender authoritarianism, where they think there should be only men and women, and those men and women should act in very exact ways. And anyone who colors outside those lines needs to be punished. Trans people really color outside those lines in those people's view. So they have seen our gains. They have seen our increased visibility and the increase in public support and how much we've been winning recently, and they feel threatened. It makes them so extremely uncomfortable, and they're fighting back because they see us as a threat. That, as weird as it may sound, is a demonstration. It is proof of our power. So I think progress comes with backlash. It happens all the time in social justice movements, and it doesn't make it okay, but it does mean that we can overcome it. Other social justice movements have made it through periods like this before, and we as trans people have made it through periods like this before. This is not the only time that we've been under attack, and I am so proud that trans people organize so hard. We are good at this. We know how to survive.
Camille, I think I saw your hand up. If you don't mind, maybe just putting your question in the Q&A, and we'll be sure to get to it. Can you, we'll go through some of the questions here, and I think one springs pretty well off of your answer. And the person says that they, live next door to their local congressperson who is their next door neighbor. And the person says that they are pro-LGBTQ, but are also a member of an evangelical church. The person is asking for how to engage their member of Congress in a one-on-one conversation about this in a way that would be helpful. And Rigo, since you are uniquely qualified, I think, to answer this question, why don't we kick this to you?
Sure, thank you. First of all, what an incredible coincidence that you live next door to your congresswoman. That is a gold mine of organizing. Props to you to even knowing who your congresswoman is. And thank you for being willing to talk with her about this issue. I mean, the top thing is to emphasize the fact that you are neighbor. What I mean is lean into that familiarity. A lot of times people think of trans folks as almost like an abstract concept, or people who live over there, far away, having nothing to do with us normal Americans. So for you, whether you're trans or a supporter, either way, for you to be like, I'm your neighbor, I'm in your district, I'm one of your constituents, and I care about this, that means a lot. That really that localizes the issue. Politicians will always say, that they're like, well, is that in my district? Is that in my district? If it's not in my district, I don't need to care. So one is emphasize the fact that you are a constituent, you're with her, you're in the same neighborhood. And two is to normalize unfamiliarity. And I know that sounds weird. It's kind of the academic jargon in messaging research for when it's important to use phrases like, a lot of us, don't really know what it's like to be transgender. Uh, it's it's really reassuring to learn that healthcare for transgender people has actually been researched for over 40 years. That's an example, something that kind of makes it okay for them to not already know the answers, and gives them permission to change their mind. It's such a subtle thing, but it's important because otherwise people can feel defensive. Like maybe you're insulting them by acting like they should already know better. So when you do that really reassuring kind of language of like, hey, I know this stuff can be confusing. Let me share some information with you. It goes a really long way. So that kind of tone of openness, I think, is really compelling for someone who's not familiar with our issues yet.
Yeah. And the reason why, for people who don't know, the reason why I said you're uniquely qualified is that you are a child of a former member of Congress. So, I think you would probably know the best way to approach that. Letty is asking about, are trans organizations networked alongside ally organizations to be able to support and mobilize around trans issues? Why don't we start with you, Shelby, and then go to Rigo?
Yeah, I think definitely. And I think that right now there's been such similarities between abortion and repro groups and the attacks on bodily autonomy in their arena that I know that we've done a lot of work to build across networks and understand their struggles and fights. I think partly how we get out of the sort of challenging political terrain that we're navigating in is to do work that's more intersectional and think about who's not at the table when we're setting the table and building the sort of political agendas that we as individuals, as organizations, as movements build. So I think for us, it's like I actually think the first question to this question is linked, is how do we start to make trans rights, and in this moment, I think a lot trans healthcare, just central to what everyone understands, which is that we all deserve healthcare, period. It doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter the type of healthcare you're accessing, but if COVID has not taught society anything, it can be that, which is our healthcare system is not working, it is broken, it is fatigued, and those who do not have resources often do not have adequate healthcare. So I think for us, another area of work that we've been doing a lot of building with is some of the religious organizing communities and thinking about how do we use faith in our work to better align with communities that they just want to help their neighbors, but they don't often know who their neighbors are. So how do we start to do that education with them and alongside them, and give them the tools so they can talk to their communities around that?
Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah, 100%. And I would also add, if you are part of an organization like this that would like to be engaged, or an organization in your community, feel free to reach out to us at A4TE. We have this almost like a database of about 1,200 trans groups around the country. That's all 50 states and also US territories like Puerto Rico and Guam and so on. We try to kind of keep tabs on what are all the groups out there interested in organizing, so that when there is a big push or a big policy fight, we can alert you. And then, you can get involved or not involved as you choose. But we have a newsletter where we can keep you posted about, hey, there's this bill in Congress, or there's this regulation coming out of Health and Human Services, HHS, or HUD, Housing and Urban Development. There's this regulation, it's going to affect trans people's access to housing or health, we need you to submit comment. Those are just examples, but this stuff is, usually not reported on by the mainstream media. Amara's out here doing the Lord's work of getting the word out about their stuff, but a lot of media outlets totally ignore our issues. So we try to help get the word out. So if you are part of an organization, feel free to email me and I can get you on that list.
Thank you. We have to go to Ben's question because Ben is making sure that we're all here today alongside Suhaili, who is the executive director of the museum, who asks, what are some of the dream exhibitions that you would have around trans and queer storytelling? And what are some of your thoughts in addition that you might have about important themes or topics that you would want to see in a museum? And either one of you can start.
I love this question. It feels luxurious to be able to envision a world where a museum would actually do this. So shout out to the American LGBTQ Museum for making it happen. I mean, one thing I would love to see would be exhibits that cover trans people in history as far back as possible. There is still this stereotype that trans people are new, that somehow trans people started existing when TikTok started or something. And that is just bonkers. That is so untrue. Trans people have literally always been here. But our opposition is trying to make it out to be a fad. So I think it is so, so powerful when we can share real examples of people being trans or gender variant or whatever it was at the time. The language has changed over time, but people, this kind of gender diversity throughout the eras, going as far back as possible. It can be hard to find these records, but they do exist. There are LGBT history archives out there, and there are some specific people we know throughout history. So anyway, I would love to see exhibits and storytelling about trans people throughout time.
That's a great question, and I'm sure that you probably have a far better knowledge of the sort of world that you're existing in. I think there's just so many trans artists out there right now, particularly BIPOC trans artists. I think like exhibitions that link the sort of historical work to the present work would be amazing. I do think there's also just like a ton of archival sort of recordings and more oral history type settings, like doing some sort of oral history related to that. People have been doing amazing documenting with like little to no resources for generations, and making sure their communities' stories are told. And I also think there's just like immense opportunity with the museum's like physical space opening up to link to sort of other history museums and thinking about like histories of gender expression in different cultures, being Native myself and thinking about Native and Two-Spirit communities, how is that like interwoven throughout culture, whether it was trans identified or not. But certainly I think the people that I come from have a very different cultural understanding of gender than maybe what more westernized cultures have. So I think things like that, and just it's looking at your list of board members, you're probably not short of amazing ideas. So whatever Amara says, I co-sign.
Someone asks here, this is a little bit more personal, I guess. Someone asks, as a trans man who passes, what impact can they have on organizing?
It's a great question. I relate to that a lot as being a trans man myself and passing. I don't pass as straight. Everybody kind of knows I'm gay, but I do pass as cis a lot of times. I mean, I think the first thing is to be aware of your privilege, to recognize all the ways that being seen as a man in day-to-day life gives you access that you didn't have before. So one is just to be aware and not be ignorant of that privilege. And it sounds like that's already the case for you, but I'm saying it for other folks for whom it might not be. And then I think the next step is to use that privilege for good. So if you are in a situation where somebody is saying these negative things, saying things that are hostile or ignorant or what have you, and they're saying it in front of you because they don't realize that you're trans, um, use that as an opportunity for advocacy if you are safe in doing so. It is a risk calculation. You're not always going to be safe disclosing that you're trans, but if you think you're going to be able to preserve your physical safety and disclose, like that's really, really powerful. And it can be a real opportunity to change that person's hearts and mind. And then the last thing I would say is to learn from the trans femmes and trans women in your life. Allyship goes in many different directions. And so there's a lot of wisdom out there from trans women and trans femmes about how trans men can be in better solidarity.
Right. Shelby, any?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is that, just naming kind of what Rigo said, but also like our communities are super diverse and broad and, like in ways that you want to, and I imagine you are, like plug into your trans community in ways that are affirming and joy-filling for you, because there's a lot of haters that would have us thinking that we shouldn't be proud of who we are and we can't be proud of who we are. And I just think now more than ever, we really need each other to weather these moments.
Mm-hmm. Can you speak about the trans and gender? Well, rephrase. Can you talk a little bit about actually the transphobia within the LGBTQ plus community writ large, and how can that be changed?
I can start, and Rigo probably has a lot more to say, being in our nation's capital in DC. I think it's hard, but I also think that this is where you've seen allies come up and support our communities time and time again. I think we have to remember our modern LGBT movement was founded by trans women of color, and it continues to be led by such. But I also think that there is moves on some of the more conservative right side to have, trans exclusionary radical feminists testify against us in legislative offices, saying that we are a threat to their sort of safety and security, which we just know is not true. And I also think the trans movement more broadly has held LGBT organizations accountable over the years. And I think now, this day and age, even the LGBT organizations that we partner with closely have become some of our biggest advocates, because they know that the fight right now for LGBT equality is almost squarely focused on trans rights. And if we don't sort of get it right, people will die, and we don't want more people to die than have historically died throughout our movements and our progress in society.
Yeah, I definitely would co-sign all that. And the only thing I would add is that one thing I found to be really effective, for better or worse, when convincing some cis LGB folks to care about trans issues, is that we have a common enemy. When anti-trans groups, when our opposition is chipping away at trans people's access to healthcare, trans people's access to accurate IDs, trans people's access to safe schools, they are doing it to try to undermine support on LGBT rights across the board. Like our opponents, our anti-trans opponents, are trying to come after you, whether you are trans or whether you're gay and in a same-sex marriage, or you've adopted kids or what have you. Like in our opposition's eyes, they're coming after all queer people, all trans people, all LGBTQ people, no matter what. And I have found that when I break that down for some LGB cis folks who may not be bought in on trans issues yet, and I'm like, reminder, the opposition is coming after all of us. They're coming after us because we're some of the most misunderstood parts of the community, but they're trying to chip away at the whole umbrella. Getting that across sometimes motivates people to get engaged. Now, of course, in a dream world, it wouldn't take that. In a dream world, everyone in kind of the LGBTQIA banner would support trans people just because that's the right thing to do and that's about values. But sometimes you got to be more practical than that to convince somebody. And I have found that breaking down the common enemy can be effective.
I wanted to just say we're coming close to the end of the program. So Camille, I don't know if you raised your hand by mistake, but wanted to just be sure that if you have a question that you just let us know so that we can get it in before we wrap. Um, uh, Another question, which I think is a good one, is what can allies do to help? What do you all think?
Well, I'll give a super timely answer since it is October 10th right now. Go vote if you are eligible, and do everything in your power to get the people in your life to vote if they are eligible. So that means one thing that means is check your registration. I know that sounds super obvious, but it is easy for your voter registration to accidentally get out of date. Depending on where you live, your voter registration may or may not get updated when you move. In some states, if you move and then you update your driver's license, it automatically updates your voter registration. That's fantastic. But in some places, that is not the case. So check your voter registration. Make sure it is accurate, that it's got your correct name, and it's got your current address, and it matches your ID. If you have any questions or worries about whether or not it matches, or like, oh my God, I'm trans and I've recently changed my name, or I'm in the middle of a name change and it's updated on some documents and not others, we can help. So go to transformthevote.org. Again, transformthevote.org. That is a really easy way to check your registration and to get help if your registration turns out to be out of date and you need some support. And then make sure to vote up and down the ballot. In a lot of states, there's already early voting. You can actually vote today in a lot of the country. Election day, November 5th, is the last day to vote. It's not the only day to vote. So make sure to go out and vote. You could do it by mail in a lot of places too. Request your ballot by mail. You can do that at transformthevote.org. And when you go vote, if you're eligible, bring some friends with you. Go to brunch after. Make it a party. Make it fun.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining. I think that takes us through our questions and our discussion. Just want to express on behalf of the museum our appreciation for you all taking the time out during a critical period to have this conversation and to kind of raise up really important issues. And so thank you all so much. I am going to turn us over to Suhaili to see if there's any general housekeeping before we end this program. But thank you all so much.
Thanks, Amara.
Thanks, Amara. Thank you, Rodrigo and Shelby, for being part of this really informative, powerful conversation and presentation. And I hope our audiences learned something. I certainly learned something, and feel really inspired by the work that all three of you are doing. And just want to thank you, echoing the gratitude that's in this room. I also want to acknowledge that Ysenio Lewis, who is an educator and artist and trans activist, was originally scheduled to be with us today, but could not due to some health issues. And so I just want to acknowledge their presence in a way, and just share their regards. And thank them for their willingness to participate in this conversation. I hope we'll have a chance to hear from them in a future program. I just want to let everyone know about upcoming programs at the American LGBTQ+ Museum. If you subscribe to our monthly newsletter, you will also get announcements about what's coming up at the museum. On October 19th, we are doing a collaboration with NewFest, New York's LGBTQ+ film festival. Lucy is putting some links in the chat for you to help support you in seeing more details about our upcoming program. This program is called Shorts: Queer Lives Across Time and America, and it will be we will be featuring 5 short films along with a Q&A with some of the directors of these films right after, and this will take place in New York City in person at the LGBT Center. On October 29th, we are having our Lavender Literary Society book club. It is the first session of our fall season. If some of you are members of our LGBTQ plus book club, you'll know we did our inaugural spring season of the book club earlier this spring, and now we're kicking off our fall season with John D'Amelio's book, Queer Legacies, Stories from Chicago's LGBTQ Archives. And that is being hosted by Mona Noriega. So you can sign up to be part of that author talk at our program's link in the chat. And then I'd love for you all to save the date. I know our schedules are very busy, so October is just around the corner, but so is November. Please save the date for 2 in-person programs coming up, one on November 13th in honor of Trans Day of Remembrance. We'll be collaborating with I Am from Driftwood to present some queer storytelling and panel conversation. And then on November 15th, we are partnering with the Museum of the Moving Image on a program with trans artist Ray Ferreira, and hope to have Amara there for that program too. So you get two back-to-backs this season with Amara Jones, which is a blessing. So I just want to thank everyone again for your time, for your energy. Thank you to our virtual audience. And we hope to see you either in person or here on the virtual stage in the virtual programming space sometime soon at the American LGBTQ Plus Museum. Thank you for your time. Have a wonderful day and a beautiful week. Bye, everyone. Take care.